chance to search his items before she finally turned up the keys to the SUV he kept parked in the pole barn. Fortunately, she knew how to drive it because she'd helped him gather logs and other supplies from the forest on their huge property for many years. She'd never driven it anywhere besides the woods, but it had to be basically the same, right? She rushed from the house, grabbing her stocking cap on the way, and used it to cover the brown curls trying to blow around her face in the whipping wind. Snow crunched under her boots, but at least it wasn't actively snowing at the moment. She ran as fast as she could to the pole barn and threw open the doors so she could retrieve the vehicle. She had it back at the front of the house as soon as she could, lined up as close as possible to the porch. Now she just had to get her father in there. That presented a dilemma for which she didn't have an answer yet, but she slid out of the SUV and headed back into the house, going straight to her father on the kitchen floor, where he still lay. She shook his shoulder lightly and stroked a finger down his cheek. "Dad, can you hear me?" There was no response, which made him completely passive. Perhaps that would make it easier to get him into the vehicle in the long run, because if he realized her intentions, he might try to fight and make it even worse for himself. And for her. Almost experimentally, she tried lifting him, hoping perhaps to prop him up enough to wedge something under him, like the nearby rug, so she could drag him. To her amazement, she was able to lift him into her arms as she focused hard on doing so. It must have been the surge of adrenaline that came from knowing she had to act quickly or he would die. She'd read stories of people lifting cars off loved ones in a panic, and that had to be what she was managing to do. She grunted and strained under the effort of carrying him, but managed to half-carry, half-drag her father out of the house to the front porch. She wished she'd had the forethought to leave the door open, as she laid him down carefully and opened it before going back to him. North was afraid she wouldn't have that same surge of adrenaline that would allow her to lift him, but it came easily, as though her muscles had already learned what they needed to do. She was just thankful that the adrenaline hadn't yet faded, and hoped it wouldn't leave her fatigued and unable to help him when it did. She propped him as carefully as possible in the front seat, though he still rested awkwardly. After snapping on his seatbelt, she rushed around to the cab and put on her own as well. Then she took a deep breath and started driving down the gravel road that served as their driveway. In a few minutes' time, she moved past the farthest point she'd ever been before, and she was thankful the roads were clear enough for her to find and follow when she reached the edge of the property. The road started out rough, but gradually grew smoother and better maintained the farther she drove. More than an hour after finding her father on the floor, she started to encounter heavy traffic. As North moved with the flow of traffic, she looked around for signs of devastation. Her father had painted an awful picture of how humanity had ended up, but she wasn't seeing ruins and rubble. What she saw looked like images she had seen in the books she'd used for her education. She was completely confused by the lack of chaos and briefly wondered if perhaps humanity had rebuilt faster than her father had anticipated. As they got closer to the city, her dread increased, even as her confusion deepened. Sam's breathing was raspy again, and she wasn't certain if they were going to make it to anything called a hospital in time. Confusion sprang from the fact that the city was much better designed and maintained than she'd expected. Dad told her people had ruined their environment and wrought destruction, turning humans against humans. He'd taken her into the mountains to keep her safe and sheltered from the chaos, to protect her from the predators people had become. She didn't see any evidence of that as she drove. She was afraid to look away from the road for too long, since she'd never driven in such conditions, but what she saw both intrigued and frightened her. It was nothing like she'd anticipated, and she found herself questioning the stories her father had told her for the first time in her life. A blue sign with an H caught her attention, and she thought that was the symbol for a hospital, if she remembered correctly from the books she'd read. She emerged to the correct lane and followed the signs until a large building came into sight. It was white and steel with huge windows.